Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch. I'm your host, Vikas Swarup. For the last 2 weeks, we have been bringing you in-depth analysis of the unfolding war in Ukraine. We continue to monitor this escalating tragedy by focusing now on the role of the United Nations. As the biggest ground war in Europe since World War II enters its third week, as civilian casualties continue to mount, as 2 million Ukrainians flee to neighboring countries in what is being described as the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe, and the global economy reels from the record high prices of oil and gas, the question increasingly being asked is, where is the United Nations in all this? After all, the United Nations was formed in 1945 with the principal objective of saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And the main impetus behind its creation was the Second World War, the deadliest and most destructive war in human history, which killed an estimated 60 to 80 million people. That is why Article 1 of the UN Charter specifically states that one of the main purposes of the United Nations is to maintain international peace and security, and to that end, to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace, and to bring about by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace. Now, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia had been brewing since 2014 and the Russian annexation of Crimea. So what was the UN doing till now? Why could it not prevent a full-fledged war from breaking out? Is this the death knell of multilateralism? Are we witnessing the dawn of a new global order? And what should India do to protect its interests? To answer all these questions, I will be calling upon two eminent experts. Ambassador Asoke Mukerji served in the Indian Foreign Service for more than 37 years, retiring as India's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in New York in December 2015. The author of 7 books, he also served in London, Moscow, Washington, D.C., Geneva, and Dubai, and opened India's first embassies in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan in 1992. Professor Varun Sahani is professor in international politics at Jawaharlal Nehru University. An expert in strategic studies, he has held visiting professorships and fellowships at several prestigious international universities, edited the South Asian Survey for 16 years, and served as the 10th Vice Chancellor of the University of Jammu and the 8th Vice Chancellor of Goa University. Welcome, gentlemen. And let me begin with you, Ambassador Mukerji. First, we saw the confused response to the handling of the COVID-19 crisis from the United Nations World Health Organization. And now we see the complete failure of the United Nations Security Council in bringing an end to the war in Ukraine. Is the UN no longer fit for purpose? And would it be fair to say that it has become irrelevant to its principal objective of maintaining world peace?
The principles of the United Nations Charter continue to be relevant for the world. And as long as the member states of the United Nations uphold these principles on the ground, there is no reason to feel that the objectives of the UN have become irrelevant. I think this was something that was asked of Dag Hammarskjöld in the 1950s, and he too replied that the principles of the Charter remain, but it's we, the member states, who fail these principles. So that's the perspective I would like to start with. And of course, viewers know that the principles include upholding sovereign equality, the peaceful settlement of disputes, the non-use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of member states, and of course, non-interference in the domestic jurisdiction of member states. So these are the principles. I think that in response to what you asked me with regard to the crisis in Ukraine, it's important to keep in mind that under the Charter, maintenance of international peace and security is the exclusive mandate of the UN Security Council. The Charter created this organ and invested it with powers to enforce its decisions using peaceful means. And if peaceful means did not yield results, then to use force, economic sanctions, or armed force. So the council is equipped to be effective. But the question is, as you have put it, why has the council not been effective in in preventing the outbreak of conflict. Today, the global television screens and media platforms are full of Ukraine. But those of us who have worked or studied the United Nations for a length of time know that this is not the first time this has happened, and definitely not the first time after the Second World War. There have been many crises which have happened, and as crises have unfolded, the Security Council has become more and more ineffective. Matters have reached such a stage that in 2005, world leaders unanimously agreed that the Security Council needed early reform to make it more effective so that its decisions could be implemented on the ground. And I think that these words of the 2005 UN summit are very, very relevant when you look at the crisis that you referred to in Ukraine. The United Nations is not irrelevant. We have to make it work better. And I think that in that context, the call for reformed multilateralism, which was made by India when the 75th anniversary commemoration of the UN took place in 2020, that is the way forward. And I think that this crisis shows that it is time for India to take a more proactive diplomatic effort to uphold the principle of international cooperation, which sustains multilateralism.
Professor Sahni, India is now a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. And during the debates on Ukraine at the UN Security Council, it has repeatedly emphasized in its explanation of votes that the contemporary global order has been built on the UN Charter, international law, and respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Now, this was viewed as a message to Russia, whose invasion of Ukraine is a clear violation of these principles. But the West is equally guilty of violating the sovereignty of many countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria, to name just the more recent cases. Why is this principle important to India? And why is the UN unable to uphold it?
Well, I mean, I think obviously, first of all, there's the normative principle at stake, sovereign territoriality. It is the basic building block of international politics. It is the governing principle for the organization of power across the globe. This is not a principle that India created. India guards its own territorial integrity zealously. Two of our neighboring states, China and Pakistan, have deployed historical arguments, ethno-cultural arguments to dispute Indian sovereignty over territories that we consider our own. India has consistently rejected claims to alter the territorial status quo on grounds of kinship across sovereign borders. India is a quintessential emerging power. And this is particularly so in terms of our relations with and within the United Nations. And for us, I think the bottom line, the bottom line when it comes to India's transformation in terms of its international status, it remains a UN Security Council reform. And Security Council reform, from our perspective, is not just about the transformation of the status of individual emerging powers such as ourselves. It goes to the heart of the systemic power transition itself. And as the United Nations goes about its business of promoting international peace and security, it really, must be careful not to so trespass or transgress upon the essential interests of any great power that it would risk systemic war. That's the reason why you have permanent membership of the UNSC. That is the reason why you have veto powers. In fact, that concern is in fact the only justification for veto powers of the P5. To that extent, therefore, the Indian perspective on this, I think, is pretty clear that the United Nations must either, adapt to these power transitions, reflect these systemic power transitions, or over the long run, the risk becoming irrelevant. So I mean, as I see it, there's a lot at stake for India here, questions are being asked about why the Indian statements or the explanations of the abstentions, were not more critical of Russia. There could be plenty of explanations for that. In fact, this is not new. India's position at the time of the Crimea crisis of 2014 was pretty similar, actually, in analytical terms. It was ultimately necessarily a low-key reaction, and there are several factors to explain it. Russia's salience in our military modernization program, but also a deep disquiet about the way in which the West has used democracy as a foreign policy tool. And that is our reality. I mean, we are, after all, we are a large, emerging power, but we are also a post-colonial state. We are also, one of the leading players in the global South. And so, all of these aspects go into our, shall we say, international personality.
It is clear from what Professor Sahni has said that the UN is unable to function effectively whenever the interests of the P5 are directly involved, and they can veto any proposal which runs counter to their interests. But there is a provision in the UN Charter which says that countries that are party to a dispute, as Russia is in Ukraine, have to abstain on any Security Council resolutions regarding peaceful settlement of the conflict. So, Ambassador Mukerji, why is this provision not observed in practice?
This is something that is part of the track record, and none of the 5 permanent members will call out a permanent member who is a party to a dispute by seeking to paint that permanent member into a corner by invoking paragraph 3 of Article 27, which, as you said, specifically says that any party to a dispute shall abstain from voting. Now, because if they do, the P5, they operate in a very collegial manner, despite the differences that have happened between them and are happening between them today. They collectively try to preserve this privilege that they negotiated between themselves in February 1945 at Yalta and imposed on the UN Charter as a condition. And I think most people today are more aware of it. But this has been something that India has pointed to even from the first session of the UN General Assembly in 1946, the first statement on the 18th of January 1946 by Ramaswamy Mudaliar, who signed the charter on behalf of India. He said that this veto is something that is not acceptable to India, but in a spirit of compromise, we agreed to accommodate the veto in the UN Charter on the clear understanding that 10 years from the day the Charter came into effect, there would be a review of all these provisions, and great powers should give up this privilege that they have forced onto us. And that is in the record, and in the Charter, that is Article 109, the review of all the provisions of the Charter after a period of 10 years. Now, the P5 have ensured, both during the Cold War and after the Cold War, that this review of the UN Charter has never been able to take place. And they have diverted attention by pointing to the need for Security Council reform as the trigger which will bring forward this review of Article 109. But that's not correct, I think, because UN Security Council reform has its own reason and dynamic, and we can come to that later. But the review of the Charter is something that was committed specifically because of the veto power. And I think that is something that needs to now be brought to the forefront, because the veto power gives the 5 countries a privilege which none of the others in the United Nations system have, because the rest of the United Nations system operates on the principle of democratic decision making. One country, one vote is there in the Charter very clearly. It applies in the General Assembly. It applies in the Economic and Social Council, which has 54 members. It applies in the Human Rights Council, which has 47 members. So there's no problem of having a large number of states in these bodies and taking decisions, because the Economic and Social Council takes decisions, the Human Rights Council takes decisions. Neither of them have the veto power. So we have shown on the ground that the veto is not really necessary. So I think that this is something that I hope now global attention will focus on again, and push for addressing the issue of the veto. And in response to the question about Russia and Russian presence, I think it's important also to understand that during the meetings on Ukraine, there was a proposal that Russia should be removed from membership of the Security Council or from the United Nations as such. And I think that this is something that that has resonated in today's environment in many among many people. But I think here in India, we need to really make the point that in 1991, when the USSR dissolved itself, there was a clear and written understanding among all the states that formed the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, which included Ukraine, and they gave it in writing that Russia was the continuing state. And when it came to the United Nations, this issue was actually raised, and the answer given legally by member states in the United Nations was that when India became independent in 1947, India, which was a founder member of the United Nations from 1945, was treated as a continuing state. India was not asked to become a new member of the United Nations, unlike the new state of Pakistan, which was asked to apply for membership and did become a new member of the United Nations. So it's the same principle that has been applied to Russia in 1991. And since 30 years have passed since that decision was taken, for people today to say that you should remove Russia from membership of the UN Security Council and membership of the United Nations, I think it comes against what in law is called the law of estoppel, that you have an opportunity, you speak your mind. If you don't speak and keep quiet, then after 30 years, you cannot reopen this issue.
Professor Sahani, several NATO countries have imposed sweeping unilateral sanctions on Russia in a bid to isolate it. The United States has now also banned the import of Russian oil and gas. Are we seeing the dawn of a new international order in which unilateral interventions will be the norm and multilateralism will be in retreat?
Well, that's a great question, really. And I mean, I think even apart from the what I will consider the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this was a question that sort of we've been all sort of wondering about, haven't we? Which is that, are we going through really a period of power transition, or are we going through a period of system transformation? Let's be very clear. The great powers have always acted unilaterally. This has been true of great powers at moments of hegemony, like the United States, through much of West Asia or the Middle East. This has been true of great powers in decline. It was true of Britain and France at the time of the Suez crisis. It is true of Russia today. Demonize President Vladimir Putin certainly, but understand that there's a history here, and Anthony Eden also then sort of probably needs to be demonized in some sort of a similar fashion. So the great powers will always ultimately behave in ways that enhance what they perceive as their core interests. There was an ideology, a theoretical understanding called neoconservatism that captured the United States at the time of the second sort of Bush presidency, as we know, and that understanding was predicated on the notion that balance of power was not as important as nature of regime. Based on an idea really of democratic peace and so on and so forth. The net result of that, of course, was the horrible mess that resulted from the invasion of Iraq. And there was absolutely not even a fig leaf of sort of sanction by the United Nations or by the UN Security Council to that particular operation. So my sense is what's happening in Ukraine today, what Russia is doing in Ukraine today is horrible. There's no question about that. We do not need to go and sit down and catalog various horrors and sort of rank them necessarily. But this has happened. This has been persistent behavior, and there does not seem to me to be any real out. Another quick sort of point I want to make is that this is something to look out for. This may be a moment in which the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, gets to be fundamentally sort of problematized. We probably don't have enough time in our discussion to go into that in any detail. But I think the entire sort of nuclear architecture, that the P5 slash N5 have maintained for so long, is probably going to come under acute stress as well.
India also has significant stakes in the Ukraine crisis. We have good relations with both Russia and Ukraine. That is why we were able to bring back almost all 18,000 of our stranded citizens in Ukraine through Operation Ganga. But we will be very adversely impacted by the sanctions on Russia and the rising oil and gas prices. So going forward, Ambassador Mukerji, what should be our strategy to protect our interests?
The first interest I would articulate is that India's growth and GDP depends on international trade. International trade contributes 40% of India's GDP. So therefore, for us, we cannot operate in a system in which there is a fractured international order, because the destinations of our international trade are diverse. We have trade with Asia, we have trade with Europe, we have trade with the Americas and with Africa. So we need a holistic international framework, and we should not therefore become part of a fractured international framework of alliances against pitting one great power against another. That would not be in our interest for the growth and transformation of India and the eradication of poverty in India. The second clear interest we have is, as Professor Varun just mentioned, is our declared status as a nuclear weapons state. We, therefore, in this year 2022, cannot now be a bystander in all the discussions that are going to take place on the impact of the Ukraine crisis on the global nuclear weapon architecture represented by the NPT. And I think that this is something that we should prepare for, because some of the issues which are involved in the resolution of the Ukraine crisis will involve the deployment of new technologies for both warheads and missiles, as well as the balance of security, because in 1975, we all looked at the indivisibility of security. So how do we transform that in the 21st century? That is going to be a very big issue for India, because India's growth will also depend on how much security India can create for her own interests, which are not going to be limited only to South Asia, but will have a larger footprint as we emerge as one of the major powers of the 21st century. And the third interest that we have is the interest in the economic framework in which India and India's economic reforms have taken us. The reforms we started in 1992 have been really sustained by India's active participation in multilateral institutions. And more than the United Nations and its agencies, I think the World Trade Organization is something that has really sustained India's emergence as an economic presence, which is destined, according to some analysts, to be among the top 3 global economies within the next decade and a half. So if we are to become a $5 trillion economy and among the top 3 global economies, we need to actually be much more proactive in now creating the new architecture of international economics and trade. This is something that for India will be slightly new, because since the Bretton Woods Conference, we have not played such a big role. But I think that the world order as it is today cannot be sustained in India's interest if it does not uphold the principle of international cooperation. And therefore, we have to look beyond the United Nations to other international organizations which are not part of the UN family, like the World Trade Organization, and invest much more effort in how that is made responsive to India's responses and demands. And one of the areas where that has to be done by us, because of the way we have gone in transforming India in the last 7 years by using digital technology, is in the emerging digital economy. I think that the time has come for India's voice now to be clearly articulated on what we expect from the emerging global digital economy. That digital economy cannot be confined to just a region like the Indo-Pacific. It is a global digital economy.
Professor Sahani, what lessons does the Ukraine conflict have for other countries? And I'm especially interested in your views on whether Russia would have invaded Ukraine if it had not given up its nuclear weapons under the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances.
Many of our viewers may not be fully aware of the fact that, until Ukraine gave them up, it really had the world's third largest nuclear weapons stockpile. That's what it had inherited from the Soviet Union. And although Russia had retained control over the warheads through permissive action links and so on, physically they were very much in the control of Ukraine. So Ukraine gave up those weapons. In 1992, the Lisbon Protocol to the START I Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. This was in 1992. In 1993, there's in fact a bilateral agreement between the Ukraine and Russia, involving not just the nuclear weapons on Ukraine's soil, but also the Black Sea Fleet. That meets very severe opposition domestically within Ukraine. The defense minister, in fact, resigns in protest. And then President Kravchuk of the Ukraine has to sort of scramble together and get something through the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament. So there's a history here, and Ukrainians certainly today are remembering that history. And they're all sort of asking, that did we make really an existential, elemental error at that time, by trusting the security assurances that the Budapest, sort of a memorandum supposedly was giving us, and in fact after the Crimea crisis, it's part of sort of diplomatic studies. We actually look at this particular document, and even the linguistic thing about which I'm sure you and Ambassador Mukerji will be well aware of, about the word sort of what is the word precisely? Is it guarantee or is it assurance? But in fact that was decided there, that the word was assurance, and that in Ukrainian and Russian that linguistic distinction is not apparent, and so it was specifically said that it was an assurance and not a guarantee. So I think a lot of states, and this goes back to my earlier comment, I think states are going to be looking anew at all of the assumptions that they have made with regards to the external security. And I think it would be a very imprudent national leadership today, and a very imprudent, diplomatic establishment and military establishment today that would not do so. So in that sense, you're right. I think a lot of bets are off. And I think a lot of these issues are going to have to be reworked. Really, first principles all over again.
With that, we have run out of time. A very big thank you to both my panelists for their illuminating insights. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine has made it abundantly clear that the United Nations is in crisis, and its Security Council is in urgent need of reform and expansion in order to restore its credibility. With international peace and security increasingly at risk and new challenges emerging which require global collaboration, the world requires the Security Council to step up to its task of mitigating dangers and making the world safe. Let us hope that the war in Ukraine finally triggers that radical change that will make this critical institution more legitimate and effective. That is all for this edition of Diplomatic Dispatch. I will see you again next week. Till then, good evening and goodbye.